G'day folks, my name is Rob and welcome back for another F1 Fantasy video. In today's video we are going through my chip strategy guide for the upcoming F1 Fantasy season and how to deploy those chips on the most desirable weekends to maximize your points in any given race week. So if you're new around here and you're enjoying the F1 Fantasy content for 2025, be sure to drop a like on the video and show some love to the channel. So we'll kick things off with the extra DRS boost, the 3x point multiplier, and how we can use that to optimize our point scoring metrics in any given race week when we use the chip. How this chip works is you're able to apply a 3x point multiplier in addition to the weekly 2x point multiplier to any two drivers in your team. And to obviously optimize the points that you can gain in this particular race week when you activate it, the best time is to apply it to two premium drivers that you think will score the most points in that particular race week. Now at the moment, we could take Max Verstappen and Lando Norris as two great examples of when to use this chip. But the conundrum that we're obviously faced with is that at this point in the season, if we were to use it on Max Verstappen and Lando Norris, we'd most likely have to have Williams and Alpine, or Alpine and Haas, or some combination of backmarker or midfield constructors to afford Lando and Max in our teams. Now, given later in the season, at which point we've accrued a bit more budget in our F1 Fantasy cost cap, the best time, at least from what we observed last season, was to save it for later in the year. So you're able to afford two premium constructors, whether that is Lando Norris and Piastri, Leclerc and Piastri, Russell and Leclerc, in addition to having premium constructors and not having to make that sacrifice elsewhere in your team. And I feel as though if you look at that on balance, the delta between using it on Max, Lando and Alpine and Haas versus Piastri, Lando, Mercedes and Ferrari, the latter option would naturally score more points when you're looking at in isolation on two weekends. Obviously, there's a lot of different variables one might need to consider for that. But if we're just looking at the most points to maximize across one weekend earlier in the season versus later, naturally later will have a higher upside. So as a result of that, when do we tend to use it most? Or at least what was the trend last time around in 2024? I'll bring some interesting data up on the screen here to give you an idea of when people were inclined to use this chip. And I will filter it by the 3x. By the way, this is f1fantasytools.com elite data. You will see that some of the most popular times to use the 3x chip were on the sprint race weekends later in the season. In fact, the top 4 times to use it were all sprint races from round 11 onwards. So you've got Austria, Brazil, Circuit of the Americas and Qatar. And given that these 3 races, the top 3 were the last 3 sprint races on the year, I definitely suspect we may see some similar trends emerging this time around in 2025. So just keep that in the back of your mind. You can obviously track the usage of chips and such in F1 Fantasy Tools Elite Data section. In respect of another chip that is also popular on sprint race weekends is the Limitless chip. How that chip works is that it allows you unlimited transfers and unlimited budget for 1 week only. The thing to keep in mind here is that when you make your transfers for the best drivers and best constructors in the top teams at that point of the season, you will get the price changes of your pre-Limitless team, and you cannot make any pre-Limitless transfers. So what I mean by that is, for example, if we take Australia as our starting point, and you want to use Limitless on a sprint weekend in, say, China, the second race week of the season, you will have the price changes from your Australia team. And when the game unlocks at the end of the race weekend, you'll notice that your team has reset back to your Australia team and the price changes in your cost cap has been dictated as such. Another loophole some people think they can exploit, but it obviously doesn't work, is that you cannot make transfers to your Australia team and then hope that those transfers flow through once you've activated the Limitless. Once you activate the Limitless, any pre-Limitless transfers for that race weekend will reset. So you'll still, again, see your Australia team when the team unlocks post-Limitless in China, if you chose to go down that path. As I've got on screen here, the best people to use it, or best assets to use it on, are the best drivers and constructors you think will score the most points at that point in the season. Now, right now, this is the second race week of the year. Again, I think this will change over the course of the year, but you could go down a route of, for China, if you wanted to use it then, as triple McLaren, Max, Charles Leclerc, George Russell, and then plug in, either a Mercedes or a Ferrari as your second constructor. And again, much like the 3X chip, the times that the Limitless is most popular is on sprint race weekends. The top 6 times to use the Limitless chip last year was on sprint race weekends. Now, there are perhaps situations where a sprint isn't always necessarily the best time to use it, but as of right now, the kind of the general consensus is to migrate towards using it on a chip, using the chip on a weekend earlier in the season, as you can see here as well. Miami, China last year, and Austria, the top 3 times to use it then, because of the fact that the consideration here is that right now, because our team value is lower, most people can only afford 3 premium assets. As if we look at a premium lineup right now with a top heavy driver and constructor build, a popular one is Oscar Piastri, Mercedes, and Ferrari. Now, later in the season, let's say we fast forward to the sprint races in Qatar and Brazil, some people may actually be able to afford, with accrued value to that point, 4, or in some cases last year, even 5 premium drivers and constructors. And if you look at it 1-to-1, 3 premium assets right now, what most people can afford, is a better time to use the Limitless, because you have an extra slot or 2 to have that differentiating premium asset. Whereas if you left it for, let's say, Brazil or Qatar, where most people can afford 4 premium assets or even 5, you're only really getting the benefit of 2 additional premium assets versus 4 is, I guess, the 4 you might have right now in China or Miami if you were choosing to use that Limitless chip then. So again, something just to keep in mind. I'm not saying it's the only best way, but kind of going off the trends from the last couple of seasons, Limitless does tend to be a very popular option at this point in time in the season. So moving on to the next chips, the No Negative and the Wildcard. The No Negative is a chip I've had a bit of a love-hate relationship over the years. How it works is that you can use the chip on difficult weekends that you might need to navigate, whether it's through wet races, high DNF tracks, sprint weekends where we've obviously got an extra session of DNF risk with the sprint race in addition to the qualifying and the Grand Prix, where when you activate it, any negative scoring categories from a driver or constructor is reset to 0. So for example, you might have a driver that qualifies 5th and then falls back to 15th in the race. You get 10 positions lost, so you're obviously a -10 for 10 positions lost. But the driver still may overtake not 100, maybe a couple of drivers throughout the race. So you'd obviously, with how this chip works, get that -10 reset to 0, but still keep the scores of any overtakes, any qualifying benefits, or anything like that. As a result, in addition to that, disqualifications, DNF penalties, those -20s, those are reset back to 0 as well. And why sprint weekends are popular is, as I said, because of the fact we have that extra weekend of scoring where there is, I guess, that additional session of DNF risk. Now, there were only 3 sprint DNFs last season, so obviously the likelihood is much lower because the stakes are also much lower. But if you throw in the likelihood of a wet race on a sprint weekend and a track that has typically a storied history of DNFs over the last few years, Interlagos in Brazil kind of fits that bill pretty nicely. Belgium, again, another track on the sprint calendar this year that has a history of rain and is a sprint weekend. So those 2 tracks to me are the ones that I think I'll be angling for to use it at. But we saw in Australia 6 DNFs in the wet weather. So if you have hesitations about your drivers emerging unscathed, if it's a non-sprint weekend but still torrential rain, I wouldn't hesitate, because we've got a grid full of rookies and 4 of them DNF'd in Australia. So obviously, to hedge those bets or cover off that risk, the No Negative also can come in very clutch at that point in time. The Wildcard, pretty self-explanatory for many of you who have played other fantasy games, but that allows you unlimited transfers up to the team value you have accrued at that point in time, and applies to all drivers and constructors in your team. So let's say, for example, by the time we get to Bahrain, you've got 105 million accrued in cost cap at that point in the season. You have a wild card, once it's activated, of course, that you can swap out all of your drivers and constructors as you please to bring in new ones. Now, the best time, as I said, to use that is when there's a shift in the template lineup or you're making excessive transfers, so multiple -10s. I think a single -10 in isolation is perfectly fine, especially earlier in the season when you're trying to either recover or build on your team value. But when it gets to a point where you're making multiple -10s, so it's a -20 or a -30 point penalty, or there's a sudden shift with new upgrades or technical directives that moves the meta lineup towards something else, then I think that's when the wildcard can very much be valuable to make that shift instantaneously. Now onto the autopilot chip. How this chip works is that it is reassigned to the highest scoring driver in your team, the 2 times point multiplier that is. So I find as though it's a bit of a scattergun approach to when I think this chip is best effective. More often than not, it can be when you expect 2 drivers in your team to score well, or where, in addition, I guess, or maybe on the contrary, to a situation where you think there is a risk that a driver you have could be prone to a DNF because of wet weather, engine failure, or anything like that, where you think the points multiplier could be obviously diluted by a possible error or anything else, a factor perhaps outside of your control. So you might have, let's say, Oscar Piastri and right now Pierre Gasly in your team. In Australia, Oscar Piastri, actually, that's a terrible example. Let's use Oscar Piastri and Nico Hülkenberg in Australia. Oscar Piastri scored 10 points and Nico Hülkenberg scored 20 points. So you might have started the weekend out with Oscar Piastri with the 2x on him. And naturally, if you didn't have the autopilot on, you'd come away with 20 points for Oscar Piastri and the standard 20 points for Nico Hülkenberg, which is what he scored. In Australia, the opposite, I guess, how the autopilot would work then in that case was, if you'd applied the autopilot at the start of the weekend, because none of these chips can be applied retroactively, is the 2x DRS boost would automatically swap to Nico Hülkenberg as the highest scoring driver in your team. This cannot work on constructors, only drivers. And so Nico Hülkenberg's score would multiply by 2 to become 40, and Oscar Piastri's score would stay at the 10 that he recorded across the weekend. So again, optimal times to use these chips would be wet races, where, as I said, there's, I guess, an uncontrollable factor that could affect what your 2 times driver would ordinarily score or potentially score. High risk DNF tracks to again protect and provide that insurance, and then perhaps the likelihood of engine penalties. So we saw last year in Baku, Lando Norris came through from P17, I think it was, to the top 4, but a lot of people were unsure whether or not kind of starting further back would pose some risk on a street track where he'd have to navigate the midfield and avoid any kind of collisions or incidents. So a lot of people who had Oscar and Lando thought, look, Oscar's in a good shot to win the race, but obviously Lando has a lot of upside coming from further back on the grid. So they applied the autopilot chip there, also given because it was a street track. So there's, again, a number of different situations to use that on that I think we'll go through in just a moment. And then the final fix, the sixth and final chip to consider, probably the one that is most hard to anticipate, just because of the fact that it is kind of based around how the weekend unfolds at that point in time. So this allows you one change to your driver lineup between the deadline. So whether it's the sprint race or the Grand Prix qualifying on the Saturday and the race itself on the Sunday, you can use it on any driver you can afford within the budget cost cap that you have. So for example, if we use, let's say, Oscar Piastri right now, you have Oscar Piastri in your team, and for whatever reason, he can't participate in the Grand Prix. You choose based on the available cost cap. Let's say you've got no cost cap available. You choose to go down the route of George Russell, who is less than Oscar, so you can naturally make that 1-for-1 swap. However, if you wanted to go up to Lando Norris instead, you'd need to have the 5, 6 million, 7 million on the side to move from Oscar to Lando Norris. Not a lot of people have 7 million sitting around in their teams. So there's obviously, when you're thinking about using it, putting aside the necessary money potentially to obviously afford that transfer between the deadline and the race. As I said, it's very hard to plan for or predict. Pre-race withdrawal, I made obviously an example of that just before. And then the back of the grid penalty, an example that comes to mind, which a lot of people used it on last year, was when Max Verstappen took a grid penalty in Belgium in 2024. A lot of people tried to pile in on an Oscar Piastri or a Lando Norris to get their qualifying points and then take Max's points from the Grand Prix and hope that he made a number of overtakes and positions gained. It worked out to an extent, but certainly Max didn't win the race, and so the extent of optimizing that chip didn't quite pay off. But there are very nuanced situations which you can't really plan for until we get to the week of that particular Grand Prix. So just keep that in the back of your mind as almost something up your sleeve that you obviously won't be able to really know or plan for much in advance. So I've got a couple of different chip strategy approaches I want to go through here to give you some ideas of how you might want to deploy it this time around. Chip strategy approach 1, which I think is going to be a very popular one this season, just based on how the game is structured and how people intend to use their chips, is to use the wildcard early in the season to obviously account for any price changes that have been pretty extreme from what we've seen after Australia. A lot of people are looking to protect value in their team and getting in assets that are more likely to go up in price based on the single race of data we've got available to us. So I think if your team values really suffered from DNFs in Australia, activating the wildcard sooner to preserve that value could actually pay off. Now I've got an arrow on the screen here for race week 5, which I think if you got lucky, and I'll admit I got a little lucky in Australia, where your team value didn't suffer by all that much, you've got 4 or 5 assets increasing in value, then perhaps consider waiting until the week before you use Limitless to use the wildcard. So you can bring in assets that are likely to gain value over the Limitless weekend. As we talked about, your non-Limitless team gets the price changes on the Limitless weekend. And then Limitless, and then when you come out of Limitless, you've got that accrued value with that higher upside from those budget building assets you've brought in ahead of using Limitless. So I'm considering using it in Saudi Arabia the week before Miami, but I think a lot of people are certainly contemplating using it sooner in China to obviously wildcard in the Strolls, the Hulkenbergs, etc. that are going up in value after Australia. Later in the season, I've decided, not decided, but thought maybe on the sprint race weekend, Belgium could be an option there. I think there's, some history of wet weather at Spa-Francorchamps, so maybe that protects against my 2X driver over that weekend. I think Final Fix here last year was a popular track, but given that we're using Autopilot in Belgium in this particular example, I've decided to use the Final Fix at Monza. It is a high-powered track and does have the opportunity for overtakes. We do, or have found that some drivers do take grid penalties at this track, simply because of the long straights that allow overtaking, so it's easier to recover either a bad qualifying or a grid penalty there. And then later in the season, the no negative in Brazil, where it is a wet weather track typically, and also a sprint race, so that extra session of DNF. And then closing out the sprint calendar with the 3X in Qatar. Now, I think the 3X probably works for any of the last 3 sprint races, as I talked about, but I just like those extra couple of races to build a little bit more value if you are trying to weave in this chip and premium drivers into your team with as much racing and budget gain weekends as possible. And the second chip strategy approach that I want to go through here is probably, not too dissimilar to how maybe some people have thought about an alternative approach for sure to the chip strategy approach on the previous screen. But some people, if they've preserved enough value, they have 5 assets or 4 or 5 assets or more increasing in value on the back of Australia, that maybe it is a great time to use the Limitless chip in China and then wildcard out of some of these assets into what you think is either a team that you could run for the next couple of weeks, 2, 3, 4 weeks, based on those increasing values, and by the end of the third or in the lead up to the third race, we'll have enough data points of what we think is going to be a threshold for those drivers and constructors to reach to obviously meet those price increases. And then there's obviously a big gap through to Belgium, where, as I said, instead of using your Autopilot, you could actually deploy the no negative, a sprint weekend, wet weather potentially, and then later in the season, instead of using the 3X in Qatar, move it to Kota, use the Autopilot on another wet weather sprint race in Brazil, and then close out the Final Fix in Las Vegas, where again, a high-powered track with the opportunity for overtake. So again, I don't think this absolutely fixes the use of these chips right now, but I think it gives us all a bit of a general guide, some food for thought as to how you might want to use these chips. One thing I will say is as soon as you activate a chip, you cannot deactivate it. So be very sure that you want to use that chip that weekend. So anyway, guys, I'm going to leave it there for now. A really comprehensive, high-level guide to how to use your chips and when. But if you've got any other alternative suggestions on when you want to use it, let me know down in the comments below. But in the meantime, guys, have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all very soon.